In the tapestry of life, where every thread holds a story, America in Black and White emerges as a haven for the voices echoing through the heart of our communities. In this podcast, we wade through the rivers of our collective experiences, celebrating the vibrant hues of change brought forth by the whispers of hope and the roars of action. It's more than just a conversation. It's a journey into the heart of our society, illuminated by the light of those daring to dream and do. Join us, and let your voice be the melody that guides us toward a dawn where every color finds its place in the masterpiece of our shared destiny. Together, let's paint a future brimming with the positives that dwell in our minds and the actions that shape.
Good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of America in Black and White, where we discuss the issues of the underserved, marginalized communities and how we can best help to solve those issues. Tonight, we have Pastor Joel A. Bowman Sr. is a native of Detroit, Michigan since 2001. He has served as founder and senior pastor of Temple of Faith Baptist Church in South Louisville. Pastor Bowman is also a licensed clinical social worker with over 30 years of experience in the mental health field. He has practiced as a clinician in the states of Michigan, Kentucky, and Indiana. Pastor Bowman has guest lectured at the Garland School of Social Work at Baylor University, Kent School of Social Work at the University of Louisville, Campbellsville University, Carver College, Truett Theological Seminary, and Baptist Seminary of Zimbabwe. A respected thought leader and freelance writer, Pastor Bowman has been quoted in the Washington Post, USA Today, the Associated Press, and the Christian Post and Baptist Press. Ladies and gentlemen, Pastor Joel Bowman, please.
Hey, Charles, how you doing?
How you doing, Pastor Bowman?
All right. I hope you can see me okay.
No, it's like there's a thumbprint or a dark spot there where your face, you got your camera down. It looks like it's facing down. Because I
Okay.
can see you there, like I see you from the side.
Okay, let me see if I can fix this. Certainly, I apologize to your audience for the technical difficulty. Let's try something else here. Hmm.
Yes, we can see you from. I can see you from the side.
Interesting. I guess the interview is already going sideways, huh? That is weird. Let me see here. Let me see. Okay.
See, like where you looking now, you looking right into the camera where I can see your face.
Okay. Gotcha. So the camera is apparently connected to the laptop. All right. Now, can you see me?
Not all the way now. Now you're behind a dark spot.
A dark spot. Huh.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's do this. Hmm. Still behind the dark spot.
Yes.
Okay. Let's do this. appreciate your patience while I figure this thing out, my brother. I'm navigating between 3 monitor screens, two on my PC, the other is on my laptop. And
Okay, what you should do is there's the laptop right there in the middle.
it is not. You want me to put the laptop in the middle?
Well, no, what I was just going to say is wherever you got the laptop is, when you go to the settings there in settings, you should go when you organize the screens and how they look. You want to always make sure that the laptop is number one.
Okay. Uh, let's see here. Let me see if I can make that happen here. Okay, I'm in settings. And
Go to where it says monitors and displays.
all right.
And we click on that is to show you how they're numbered. Should be 1, 2, and 3.
Right.
And so where the laptop is, you want to move the 1 to that.
All right. Let me see here. Okay, I'm trying to locate where the monitors are in settings here.
Do you see where it says monitors, displays, and things of that nature? They're in the settings.
There's a piece that says devices, Bluetooth, printers, mouse.
No, not that
Um,
one. It should be above that.
hmm. Okay. Okay. Location, camera, microphone. Not there. System, display, sound, display.
Yes,
Okay.
displays.
All right. Okay. So identify. It looks like the laptop is already number one. Let me see. One. Let me see. Yep, the laptop is already number one.
Okay. So is it telling you, did you identify them already?
Yes, they're already
Okay, if you
identified.
identified, now you should hit the other thing, which I think is to set or apply.
Okay. Let's see. Hmm.
Let's just move forward here with the interview. If you
Okay.
guys don't mind.
And while we're doing that, I'll multitask and see if we can get this figured out. But yeah, we can get started.
Yes, sir. Let's start by talking about your freelance writing.
Yes,
Can
sir.
you tell our audience what inspired you to become a freelance writer?
I guess it's in the blood. So just about everyone in my immediate family was a writer to some degree. Certainly, my mom, she was an English teacher and an English major in undergrad. And so she had an inclination toward writing. My dad also was a writer, though he was self taught. He was a brilliant man. He dropped out of school in the 10th grade to take care of his family during the time leading up to the Second World War. So he had a lot on his plate, obviously, but he was a writer. And then my siblings all write to some degree. And I would say that out of the siblings, I'm probably the one who has done the most writing over a longer period of time. And what attracted me to writing was that I've just always had an inclination for the pen. Just to, of course, years ago, I would manually write using a pen or a pencil to do my initial drafts. And then, of course, in this age of technology, I have gone to using my laptop or my iPad or my iPhone to begin to put seeds for writing particular articles into motion. So, just my natural inclination and witnessing people respond affirmatively to my writing as if it made a difference or they could resonate with it in some respect. So, those are the things that kind of made writing appealing to me.
So, can you tell us what are some of the things that you have written about?
So, I've written a lot on the intersection of Christianity, racism, and politics. That has generally been my most favorite area in which to write. So, I've written a lot on Trumpism and its implications for the Christian church in America. I've written pieces on particular figures. I've written a piece on Herschel Walker. I've written a piece on other Black Republicans and the grift that they're engaged in. I've written pieces that have been historical in nature, pieces, let's say, on Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, I posted on my Facebook page yesterday a piece I did a couple of years ago for Baptist News Global on Dr. King. So
Mhm.
I like delving into history. I like delving into politics, but also their intersection with faith, and particularly the Christian faith. That tends to be kind of the arena in which I write.
Okay. So, can you tell us how do you balance your writing with other responsibilities?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's kind of like the same way I approach preaching. It's very organic in terms of how it comes to pass. I think that all of life provides me with sermon material that I can preach. And the same would be true as it relates to my writing, that when I write with my computer in one hand and the newspaper in the other, as it were. You know, I write in a manner that addresses the current issues of our day.
Okay. So, can you share a memorable experience from your writing career?
Sure, I can recall a time in which a particular article that I wrote on why Christians or why no Christian should vote for Donald Trump. That particular piece was initially published in a newspaper called The Progressive,
Uh
but
huh.
it was picked up by MSN. And as a result of it being picked up by MSN, then it reached a larger audience. And so that was very memorable in the sense that I became aware of the fact that, when you write and when it's picked up by larger outlets, that naturally gives you a larger audience to impact and to influence. And so that was an exciting experience for me. I remember another piece that I wrote, and it was titled White Evangelical War on Truth. And that
Mm-hmm.
was written for Baptist News Global. And that probably got somewhere around 30,000 views, something like that. And so that was an exciting thing as I put a lot of time and effort in that piece, had grounded it in research and history and scripture. And I think that the combination of those things led to it being a highly viewed article. So periodically, I'll have those times in which it seems like there's a particular article that really resonates with people. And that kind of lets me know that, I'm scratching where people itch.
Oh wow! So that was good. That's going to lead into the next question: is when you're writing these pieces,
Uh huh.
um, like what is the intent other than being informative? Because it sounds like, and from what I have read for some of your articles, is that they do speak a whole lot of truth, make a whole lot of sense, and are always very logical. And
Hmm.
so when you write those, I mean, like, what are you trying to get from those articles? Because they're really hitting the gut.
Well, ultimately, I'm writing, Charles, to change lives. That may sound trite, but I do believe that writing can be a powerful tool of persuasion. And so, yes, I'm looking to inform people in terms of historical bits of information, but ultimately, I am looking to enlighten them and ultimately inspire them to action. You
Mhm,
know, I I think that there are a couple of things that indicate that you've written an effective piece.
mhm,
One would be that it generates a lot of discussion. It generates perhaps some questions that people are looking to get clarity with. And then the second thing is that when I write, ultimately, I'm wanting to motivate people to get up and do something with the information I'm providing. And of course, before they are able to do something, there must be an attitudinal switch or an attitudinal shift in terms of how they think about certain issues.
So, I noticed here at the bottom of your bio, as I was reading it, and it said that you've been quoted by the Washington Post, USA Today, the Associated Press, the Christian Post, and the Baptist Press. Are
Yes.
you writing op-eds for any of these journalistic newspapers, companies, or whatever have you?
Those particular ones that are listed, no, I've not written for any of those, though I have submitted different pieces to them. They've not been accepted as of yet. However, I have been quoted in those. Now, there's a slew of other periodicals for which I've written that I can list some. I mentioned Baptist News Global, The Progressive, The Witness, which is a Black Christian collective that was founded by my friend Dr. Jamar Tisby, who's written quite a lot. He is a New York Times best-selling author with
Mhm.
The Color of Compromise, How to Fight Racism, and more recently, The Spirit of Justice. So I have written for other periodicals, other online sources. There's another piece called The Front Porch that I've written for. I've written for the Michigan Chronicle. I've written
Mhm.
for a few other Black newspapers here nationwide. So it's a variety of places where I've been published.
So, can you tell us what topics do you enjoy writing about the most?
Like I said earlier, racism at the intersection of Christianity, because, one of my callings, I believe, is to expose the ways in which the American or the Western church has been complicit in racism. And I think that, when we consider Donald Trump being in office now for the second time, it would have been impossible for him to be in office were it not for the support of white Christians in America, particularly white conservative evangelicals. So a lot of my writing has to do with kind of exposing the different layers of information as it pertains to, why is it that so many white Christians have been drawn to a person who clearly is amoral. I tell people all the time that Donald Trump is not immoral. To say someone is immoral is to say that they lack morals, but I would say that Donald Trump is amoral in the sense that he has absolutely no moral compass. And so, one of the things I've been trying to uncover is why is it that some of the same people who in the 90s were saying that character mattered as related to political leaders, all of a sudden they're in Trump's pocket, and there's a whole list of things that we can talk about in terms of why that is the case. Uh, I'm praying I can get this video up and running for you. I apologize again. I cannot. Let's see. Video settings. How about there?
Okay, now I'm about turn to your left. No, to your other left.
To my right.
Okay, now come over to that same side. Now look up. uh, to the right. There, where your hand
Yeah.
that is right there. There
So
you
you
go.
can see
Yeah.
me. All right. I'm looking at the camera. Okay. All right. We finally got it, man. Hello, audience. You got to remember, Charles, that when I made it through graduate school in 1992, I did so on a Smith Corona typewriter. So
Oh,
I am tech challenged. I am tech
oh
challenged.
wow.
So the next time you have me on your show, and I pray you'll have me back,
Yes,
we got to
sir.
make sure to get on early to work out all the tech details. But hello to your audience. Thank you so much for your patience. And I hope that our conversation so far has been informative.
Oh, yes, sir. And because when we talk about this, your writing, I mean, to be a freelance writer, a lot of people just don't have the skills or the talent to do that. And
Hmm.
apparently, your articles are more than just what they want to get out to the public. But I mean, you're doing it more than one time, and that there's like a lot of places here
Hmm.
that your work is going to.
Yes.
Uh, can you tell us how has your writing evolved over the years?
Oh, another splendid question. I would say, as I have read more, as I have grown and experienced life more, that naturally my writing has become more mature in the sense that I'm writing from a wealth of experience, a wealth of different types of opportunities that I've had to interface with different people. And so I would say that my writing these days is much more well informed, much more grounded than it was, let's say, 30 or so years ago when I first started writing. So I first published really in high school. I was editor of my high school newspaper. And so I had that experience behind me. And then when I got to college, I started writing quite a bit for the Michigan Chronicle, which is the black newspaper there in my home state of Michigan. But in terms of my writing evolving, I would say that I've become, and I'm going to use these terms because they're descriptive. I would say I've become a bit more militant in terms of my writing, a bit more edgy in terms of my writing. There was a time when I would spend hours trying to craft a narrative in such a way that, everyone would accept it immediately and it would make everyone happy and comfortable. No, obviously, when you deal with issues such as racism and religion, etc., and politics as well,
Mm-hmm.
people are not necessarily going to be in agreement with you. And
Mm-hmm.
in fact, they may become very uncomfortable with your writing style, what you say, and how you say it. But sometimes that's the only way to provoke change and transformation in people, is that you have to bring about some degree of discomfort in them. And I firmly believe, and this is where I land as a licensed clinical social worker or a therapist, is I firmly believe that as human beings, we are at the precipice of tremendous growth when we are most uncomfortable. Discomfort needs to be embraced as our friend, not an enemy. You know what I'm saying? And so, oftentimes, in order for people to go through that metamorphosis and to experience change in terms of their philosophy, their worldview, it requires them to feel, the cognitive dissonance that comes along with new information that they're gaining. Okay. Because in my writing, I seek to shine the light on things that people perhaps have never been made aware of. And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, my writing has evolved in the sense that it's become, I would say, more provocative, more edgy, and in some respects, more militant, because there was a time when I dealt with racism in my writing that I tried to be as congenial as possible. And certainly, I don't try to offend people just for the sake of offending them. But by
Mm-hmm.
the same token, I think I have a more realistic approach. And that is to say that you just have to put the truth out there as eloquently and as effectively as you can and let the chips fall where they may.
Mm-hmm. Now, I would say if you're going to say anything about your writing, I would not classify it as militant. I think
Hmm.
your writing is more progressive. That's why the provocativeness is there,
Right.
because when it's about the truth and it puts it all out there from a philosophical
Mhm.
perspective, to where it's right here on the table.
That's
And so,
good.
with it being right there on the table, now I think you're right about those to the right. They are not trying to hear that,
Hmm.
and
Nope.
so they may be the ones. That's why they probably have a problem with that, especially as you speak of those evangelicals, especially.
Especially, I mean, listen, I've had close proximity to white evangelicals, beginning with my time in undergrad. I was a student leader at one point with Campus Crusade for Christ, which is a very large parachurch organization and is at the heart of white evangelicalism. And so, from my experience there, and then when I was briefly affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention before I left because of its racism, I've
Mhm,
had proximity to white evangelicals there. And yes, there is an awful lot of resistance there, particularly when it comes to them reading the writing of a Black writer.
mhm,
And I believe at the heart of that resistance is simply white supremacy. They don't understand the extent to which, or I should say, many don't understand the extent to which white supremacy is woven into the fabric of their theology.
mhm,
How they do church, how they see Jesus, how they see God, right?
mhm.
How they see preaching, how they see right. All of that I think has been informed and shaped by white supremacy. And when you call it out, then, we have a saying among Black preachers that a hit dog hollers, right?
Oh,
That when you're
definitely.
saying something and you're hitting the nail on the head, as it were, then the person that protests the most, that indicates that perhaps they are the very ones that you're referencing in that particular piece.
Now, I want to ask you this before I move on to the next question, because this is a great follow up to what you just said.
Mhm.
Um, when people are so used to getting, let's say, writings from, let's say, the Christian perspective from the white evangelical cult.
Oh, you
When
called it
they're
a
so
code, huh?
used, when they're so used to getting,
You're trying to start something, man.
no, but I mean, but when they're so used to getting that kind of writing and those lectures, as you want to call them, because they're not preachings, but
Mm.
they're getting those lectures and they're getting all of this correspondence from this particular group. Would you consider those writings to be more like a brainwashing effect, to where it's like Fox News, where you continuously to get the same thing over and over again, that it actually controls everything about the mind, where these people don't know how to read anything else?
Yeah, so I think part of the problem with white evangelical theology, how they approach the knowledge of God and the knowledge of the scriptures and the application thereof, is that oftentimes they're teaching people what to think rather than teaching them how to think. And my writing is very much grounded in critical thinking. You
Right.
know, it challenges people to think for themselves. You know, my goal is not to create a clone of me. Okay.
Right.
But unfortunately, in many white evangelical spaces, the goal is to create clones that all think alike, they sound alike, they preach alike. You know, it's interesting to note that here in Louisville is the flagship seminary of the Southern Baptist Convention, which has as its president Dr. Al Mohler. And the interesting thing about Dr. Mohler is that he's one of the most influential voices in white evangelicalism and white Christendom in general. And there are so many students of his at the seminary and beyond who they dress like him, they look like him, they preach like him. And so there is a lot of emphasis, I think, in those spaces on uniformity, on everyone saying exactly the same thing the same way. And any departure from that is a departure from orthodoxy. Any departure from that means that maybe you're not following Christ as closely as you should, or maybe you're not even a Christian. Okay. And so any opinion that departs from whatever the party line is in those spaces tends to elicit questioning and criticism. Let me give you an example. So there's a person that I recently met at a church, and I had been attending some groups at that church, some meetings, and I said, "There's a piece I wrote on why white Christians need to learn about lynching, and I'd like for you to read it." And he said, "Yeah, I'll read it." And I would periodically come back to him and ask him, "Well, have you read this?" And eventually he got to it and he read it. I said, "Well, I'm open to feedback. Tell me what you think." And this is what his response was, Charles. "I appreciate your perspective. I would, however, like to talk to you in person because I've got some questions I need to ask." Now, that's not intimidating to me, as I said earlier, that I believe good writing can elicit more questions than it does answers. I get that. But oftentimes, when I have that type of interaction with a white evangelical, uh, they approach that conversation from the perspective of trying to prove me wrong, or trying to say that maybe I was a bit too harsh, or maybe I generalized too much in terms of talking about how white evangelicals deal with the issue of race. But one of the things that I'm sure you've noticed in reading some of my pieces is that I try to ground things in research. You know, I cite quite a bit the work of Dr. Robert P. Jones in
Mhm.
Public Religion Research Institute. I
Mhm.
cite Pew. I cite other sources of statistics so that
Mm.
people will understand that I'm not just talking out of the side of my neck, but I'm speaking in a way that's not only grounded in scripture, but in a way that's grounded in solid research. And it's hard for people to argue with numbers. You know, when you say, for instance, that 75% of white evangelicals had no problem with Trump saying that immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country.
Right.
75% of white evangelicals essentially agree with what Trump said about immigrants poisoning the blood of our nation. Can you imagine that? Especially given all of the things that the Bible has to say about welcoming the immigrant and loving the immigrant. I mean, when you look at it, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were refugees when Jesus was born in that manger. And so when you look at statistics like that, they're really quite revealing in terms of how people really think. You still there, Charles? Charles? All right. I cannot hear you. Can you hear me? I'm going to leave and come. Right. I can see you. Can you see me?
Yes.
All right.
Okay, so I think that this should actually we should be good to go. I'm gonna say, okay. I want to apologize for that because we're having.
You froze up on me, Charles. You there? Charles?
Okay, you're back, Pastor Bowman.
I'm here.
Okay, yeah, we're supposed to be having this bad weather from for all this snow and everything. So I apologize for this because it's like this thing that went out twice.
Okay.
Whew. So at any rate, I apologize to everybody that's watching the show, and please forgive me. But for the bad weather that we're having, it's causing me a lot of technical difficulties. We were at the point where you were explaining about the issues as far as like the white evangelicals, and you had this guy read this piece that you wrote,
Mm-hmm.
and you were at that point when things went out.
Gotcha. And so oftentimes what happens when I will provide one of my pieces for a white evangelical to read, I'm anticipating on the part of some of them that there's going to be some resistance and there's going to be some discomfort. And what I began to say before is that what we as human beings need to recognize, and I know this as a therapist, as a clinical social worker, is that discomfort is really the porthole that leads to growth. You know, some people, when they read something or they hear something that makes them uncomfortable, then the natural default is to point the finger at the person that wrote the article or preached the sermon, as if to say the problem is with them, rather than really taking an introspective look and asking yourself the question, well, why is it that this made me uncomfortable? Is there perhaps some bias within me that makes me resistant to this new information that I'm reading? And so I think that that explains why I get some of the reactions that I get as I'm writing and as I'm getting feedback, is because people are uncomfortable and do not have the emotional maturity to embrace that discomfort and look at it as an opportunity for growth.
Mm. So, what challenges have you faced as a freelance writer?
Well, I've literally had a couple of guys do a hit piece on their YouTube channel on one of my pieces, where they basically took an entire hour and tried to basically rip it into shreds. And it's interesting how I found it. You know, periodically I will do a search on myself to kind of see what's out there, to see if my footprint online has grown at all. And so one day, this was about 2, 3 years ago, I did a search online and I found that someone had taken one of my articles, which was White Evangelical War on Truth, and they had done basically a hit piece on it, talking about the various ways in which they disagreed with it. They made certain assumptions about me based upon my writing, which were dead wrong. And so I actually found out how to get in touch with them, reached out to them, and we did a 3-way Zoom meeting. And I
Hmm.
basically confronted them and said, look, you know, if you thought my article was that provocative, you simply could have reached out to me. I'm easy to find on social media. You could have reached
Hmm.
out to me and you could have had me on your show and we could have had, an honest intellectual engagement on the article. But no, you chose to go the punk way and do a hit piece on my article. And so that's one of the challenges I've had is, people being critical of something I've read or said, but not having the courage to come to me direct and say whatever they want to say.
Mm. So normally, like when you found this, that they were doing this on the YouTube channel, I mean,
Hmm.
have you found other instances of people trying to go through your work and break it down and make sensibilities of it as to saying what you're thinking and what you're saying when you're writing? Have you found any more of that?
Sure. So whenever I post something online, invariably, there'll be a troll or someone who will jump online and they'll, I call them keyboard gangsters, right? Uh, and they will say something untoward about the article, but they're not really serious about engaging in a discussion that's rooted in critical thinking. They simply want to throw stones, and so yeah, I mean, any writer worth his or her salt is invariably going to come against people like that.
How do you stay motivated to write consistently?
Ooh, good question. I don't write as consistently as I ought to or as I'd like to, but however consistently I do write, I think what motivates me are the things, as I indicated to you earlier, the things that are happening in our world today, current events. Sometimes if a holiday is approaching, then that may be motivation for me to write. For instance, whenever Dr. King's holiday approaches, I always consider writing something new on Dr. King. Or if Christmas is approaching, I may write something on the Christmas story that's a bit of a different angle that people normally would come from. So those are things that motivate me to write as consistently as I do. And another thing that motivates me to write is people simply asking me, when are you coming out with something new? And that gives me, the real strong motivation to roll up my sleeves and to do some more writing.
Mhm. Can you describe your writing process?
Hmm. You're really asking some good questions, Charles. My writing process, I have to consider to what extent there is one particular process. So sometimes I may think of a title,
Mhm.
and as I think of a title that's provocative, and whenever I think of a title, I look at titles for articles in the same way I look at titles for my sermons that I preach on Sunday or whenever else, is that they are in essence the billboards for the sermon or the billboards for the article. And my
Mhm.
hope is to provoke enough interest by people seeing the title that they would read further on and see what the rest is saying. So I would say that oftentimes I'll start out with the title, and then as I start out with the title, I will kind of put a skeleton together, maybe an outline of some things that I would want to cover under that title. And once I have the skeleton together, then I try to put some meat on the bones, as it were, as relates to, what's been said rather, under each point, under each bullet. And a lot of that has to do with research that I do, history that I'm grounding my writing in, or whatever. And that's where the real work comes in. The work doesn't really begin for me until I really get into the outline that I've written for myself for the article. That's when I really roll up my sleeves and I begin to critically think through the process of, okay, if it's a persuasive piece, how can I persuade persons to think differently as a result of this piece? If it's a historical piece, how do I craft a historical narrative that's accurate, as opposed to perhaps a false historical narrative? So that's kind of, in general, the process I go through in my writing.
Let me ask you something because like I'm gonna give you an example. Like for me, when I'm like looking, let's say if I'm looking at something that they're talking about on the news, or if
Mhm.
I see something that just go across the screen, right? Especially if I think it's noteworthy and it's newsworthy, and I kind of like just get a grasp of that. That kind of like throws everything in my head. I write it down, and then I have to go and do a blog post.
Mhm.
So in a situation like that, let's just say it's an impromptu moment,
Right.
and let's say, you're driving, and in the process of driving, you see some I'm gonna call it some political drama, okay, that's taking
Mhm.
place as you're driving down 65 there in Louisville,
Okay.
and you see this political drama.
Mhm.
If you see something that's actually noteworthy like that in that situation, is
Mhm.
there a moment where you just have to stop and at least write it down so you can go home and write about it?
Yeah, there are times that I will just literally stop what I'm doing, whether it's driving or working on something else, and I will jot some notes down, because oftentimes what happens with writers is that because we don't have a systematic way of notating the nuggets that come into our heads, we lose those thoughts forever sometimes. And so I'm pretty intentional about, whenever those ideas pop into my head, that I write something down that's going to trigger my thoughts further. That's going to give me some idea as to where I need to head.
So, what advice would you give to aspiring freelance writers?
Right on, my brother, right on, my sister. In other words, just find reasons to write. It could be writing in your own journal or diary, whatever you want to call it. Could be writing poetry, other forms of creative writing, whatever opportunities that you have. And you can really make opportunities to write. And another thing I would say is submit, 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 submit. So when you write pieces, uh, think about newspapers or magazines for which you wish to write and in which you want to be published. And, I mentioned earlier in our discussion that though I've been quoted in a number of papers like Washington Post, USA Today, I have not had the privilege of being published by either of those entities as of yet. But my train of thought, my mentality is I'm going to keep on submitting to various periodicals, various publications, and eventually, it will happen. And in the process, what I found is as I submit to more and more papers and more magazines, that I'm sharpening my craft. I'm sharpening my pen in terms of the writing. So I would say just make up any old excuse to write. Start with a journal, start with a diary, and then once you've actually put a formal piece together, uh, plan on submitting that. And listen, the third piece I would say is don't let rejection disappoint you, because rejection is just a part of the work, you know. And I've gotten to the place now, Charles, in my writing, that even if the Washington Post never accepts one of my pieces, I still know I'm a good writer. Even if Christianity Today never accepts one of my pieces, I still know that I'm a good writer. And I simply write it off as something that they're losing, right? They're
Right.
losing the opportunity to publish me. And
Mhm.
so I've made that shift in my thinking.
So how do you handle writer's block?
Um, by turning down the noise. For me, whenever there's writer's block that says that I've got a lot on my mind, perhaps I'm in a stressful period of my life. And so, in those types of periods, it's important for me to sit down and just be quiet, to sit down and be quiet, and to just allow life to speak to me, allow God to speak to me in terms of what I need to be writing
Mhm.
about.
So let's make this transit over to your being a pastor and community advocate.
Hmm.
Tell us what led you to become a pastor. What got you to the church?
Well, what got me to the church is I had a drug problem. My mom and dad drugged me to church. They drugged me to Sunday school. Right. I'm sure a lot of your viewers and listeners can relate to that. I was essentially born in the church,
Mhm.
and my parents were both very active. My dad was a deacon, and then later on, he acknowledged his call to preach. And then my mom was a Sunday school teacher. So I got it honest. I was rooted and grounded in the oldest African American congregation in the Midwest, the historic Second Baptist Church of Detroit, which was part of the Underground Railroad, which hosted preachers such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Dr. Gardner C. Taylor and Dr. Samuel Proctor and Dr. Frederick G. Sampson and some of the great pulpiteers in the Black church. And so I grew up in a rich tradition of preaching. And it's not been until recent years that I really have come to appreciate it. I took it for granted before. But anyway, because I was raised in the church and because I was highly active, there are people who would come to me and say, Joel, you're going to be a preacher. And I resisted that for a while. In fact, I went all the way through undergrad and I resisted it. Uh, Even went through grad school and resisted it. But there came a point in time in which I could not resist any longer. And so in 1994, over 30 years ago, I acknowledged my call to ministry and I preached my initial sermon there at Second Baptist. And it's just preaching is not just what I do, it's who I am. It's an extension of how God has wired me, how God has gifted me. And so, by the way, just like I feel like I've been called to preach, I feel like writing is an extension of my ministry as well.
Okay. Well, you know, now that definitely makes sense because I mean, I know, especially when you have to put your sermon together, you do your research and you decide you want to do this and you go all the way through. So I'm not sure exactly what the whole 9 yards go with that, but when you're writing up that sermon, I'm sure that
Mhm.
that you've got to make sure that that thing is on point. So when you're actually preaching it, you want people to receive the word.
That's right. That's right.
How do you integrate your faith into your community advocacy work?
Well, um, I simply do it when I consider the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 25 through 27, I believe it is, where Jesus is giving his Olivet discourse, his Sermon on the Mount. Uh, it really is an ethical masterclass, a masterclass in how we as disciples of Christ are supposed to live, are supposed to govern ourselves. And so, what I love about the Sermon on the Mount is that Jesus gives his disciples instructions that would go far beyond a church gathering.
Mhm.
And it really gets to the issue of community engagement. You know, Jesus talks about, in as much as you've done it unto the least of these, my brothers, you've done it unto me. You know, when you consider how Jesus dealt with the issue of justice, how Jesus dealt with the issue of humility, how Jesus dealt with the issue of power and privilege. Okay. All of those things are addressed in some way in his Sermon on the Mount. And so I think as an extension of that, I try to engage myself in my local community. Of course, during the situation in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, you know, naturally I got involved in protest because I felt that, you know, as a Christian, I believe that every human being is created in the image of God, and therefore they are to be treated with dignity and respect. And obviously, Breonna Taylor here in Louisville, George Floyd, those two individuals were not treated with dignity and respect, but the exact opposite. They were dehumanized. And so it is based upon the ethical principles of the Sermon on the Mount that I engage myself here in my local area.
Wow. So, can you share a story of a time when your work as a pastor made a significant impact on
Mhm.
someone's life?
Mhm. Um, I can recall one time it was our church anniversary. The house was full, and there were a number of visitors present. And I stepped out of the sanctuary for a moment to go to the restroom, which was at the front of our church at the entrance of the sanctuary. And as I was coming back to my seat on the front row, there was a sister that pulled me aside and said, now, mind you, this happened in the middle of the service. She pulled me aside and she said, Pastor, I just want to let you know that I am sick of life. I'm thinking about taking myself out and taking these children out that's with me. And by taking them out, she meant literally murdering them as well as dying by suicide herself. So in that moment, I had to kind of call on my mental health training. And I said to her, Sister, please, as we're in the midst of this service, can you make a contract with me verbally that you will not do anything to harm yourself or your children until we've had the opportunity to meet after worship? I promise you that immediately after worship, I will make time to meet with you. And she said, Yes, Pastor, I agree to do that. So immediately after worship, we met in my study, and I kind of did an assessment as to what was going on in terms of her depression. anxiety and whatnot, and how she felt overwhelmed as a grandmother. And I was able to help her connect the dots and made a referral to get her mental health treatment. Um, as it turned out, she no longer was suicidal, homicidal. By the time that we got to the end of that conversation, and she was in a position where she was safe, her kids were safe. And I think the key was for her, me giving to her some resources that she could go to for support. She was just feeling so overwhelmed, trying to raise these grandchildren, that she really needed some resources. And so that's one time I believe that I really made a difference. That literally someone's life was hanging in the balance in that situation.
Before I go to this next question, how we doing on time? I mean, I know we've been in and out of these technical difficulties. How
Right.
we doing on time?
I can give you 4 more minutes.
Okay, well, let's just do this question here. We'll have to get you back on the show here.
All right.
How do you address the needs of your congregation and community?
Well, um, I think one thing that we learned from the book of Nehemiah, as Nehemiah was being called by God to lead the Israelites in rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem that had been burned down, the first thing that he did was he inspected the damage, or he had others to inspect the damage for him. And so, what I try to do with my membership is I try to stay close enough to them to find out exactly what their needs are, what they perceive to be their needs. And so there's been a saying that's been stated quite a bit within ministerial circles, that a shepherd ought to be so close to the sheep that he or she begins to smell like the sheep. In other words, there ought to be a very dynamic relationship that goes on, in
Mhm.
which the pastor is getting to know his congregation, and the congregation is getting to know him. Let me give you an example. So, uh, everyone who's a member of my church pretty much knows that I'm a mental health professional as well as a pastor. And they know, for instance, that I've been on psychiatric medication. I've been transparent, even from the pulpit, because I think that one thing that pastors need to do is destigmatize mental illness or mental health issues. And one of the ways we do it is by addressing those issues from the pulpit, perhaps being transparent about our own stuff to some degree. And so, because of my transparency, I had a lady come up to me about 3 weeks ago, and she is getting over the death of her mother, who was also a member of our church, a charter member, helped us found the church almost 24 years ago. And so she's dealing with grief and loss issues. And she mentioned to me that a doctor of hers had prescribed an antidepressant, and she was feeling a little antsy about taking that antidepressant. Well, I was able to help her get over her anxiety. She ended up taking her medication. She's beginning to feel better. And so that's a way in which I can meet the needs of the flock as I get to know them and as they get to know me. I think it needs to be mutual. That's how I can better learn what the needs are of the congregation. And really, the same principle is true as it relates to the community. Spending time in the community, talking to our neighbors, finding out what concerns them about the neighborhood that surrounds the church. It's all about relationship, man. Really, when you build a relationship with people, then you're in a better position to find out what they really need.
Mm. Well, as we're gonna bring this to a close, is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with and I'll just explain how things are going to work here afterwards. Because I mean, I'm sorry about the technical difficulties. Is there anything you want to leave the audience with?
Yes. So this is airing the day after President Trump's inauguration. And I know that a number of your viewers and listeners are feeling a lot of anxiety about his administration, and understandably so. I do think that he is a clear and present threat to our American democracy. But I want to remind marginalized people, Black and brown people, people who have been subjected to oppression, that while we've not been through this specifically before, we've been through this in the sense of we've had to deal with oppressive systems, and we've had to deal with racist individuals before who have power and position, and we've had the resilience to make it. Some of us are old enough to have made it through the Jim Crow South, right? Others of us are old enough to have experienced the assassination of Dr. King. And so, what I'm saying is, one of the things that can help you get through this present situation with the Trump administration, this second presidency that he has, is understanding what you've been able to overcome in the past, because that's something that you can build on, and that's something that can motivate you to keep on keeping on in spite of the dangers that might be ahead.
Well, I want to say thank you, Pastor Bowman, for being
You're
here
welcome.
again. I'll definitely want to invite you back to the show. But for those of you that are watching on YouTube channel, especially, I apologize for the technical issues. We'll have Dr. Bowman back, and hopefully the weather will be much clearer tomorrow to where we won't have these technical issues with this internet. But for those of you that are watching, and if you have not, please subscribe and hit the notifications button where you can watch all of our shows live, or you can go back and watch all the previous shows as many times as you like. Pastor Bowman, thank you. I'll get some dates over to you, and I want to
Awesome.
thank you all for watching tonight, and please come back and watch us again tomorrow night